Hi everyone, thank you so much for being connected today. Today I'm going to give you a webinar to explain all the new features that we have included in our sample gallery apps, which some of them match to the recent updates that have been released with the summer 20 release. My name is Alba Rivas. If you don't know me, I'm a developer evangelist at Salesforce, and this is my Twitter handle in case that you want to ask me any questions. Also, you can use the chat window to ask any questions and I'll try to answer. This is the forward-looking statement slide, which means that Salesforce is a publicly traded company and you should make purchasing decisions based on the functionality that is generally available and not beta or pilot. However, in sample gallery apps, we always include references to GA features most of the times, so you don't have to worry about that much regarding the content of this webinar. First of all, I want to explain to you what the sample gallery is. If you don't know the sample gallery, this is a web page that you can access from Trailhead on trailhead.salesforce.com/sample gallery. And in this web, you are going to find a set of apps. Let me navigate there for a second and show you what it is about. And each app is going to have a description and also information about the different features that the app showcases. We built this sample gallery because we want to give developers tools to learn all the technologies that we have in the Salesforce platform to build applications. This includes pro code technologies as Lightning Web Components or Apex, but also includes low code technologies. For example, we have an app called Automation Components that is fully built with low code. Some of the apps simulate a customer use case. That is the case of e-bikes that simulates a bike retailer company application. Dreamhouse, which simulates a real estate application, and also Easy Spaces and Red Goods Insurance. Also, we wanted to create some apps to give solution to specific coding problems or specific problems when building apps. And that's the reason we created LWC recipes, for example, that shows you how to solve a specific problem with Lightning Web Components. It contains simple examples, very simple examples that have no more than 30 lines of code. We also created the same version of the app, but open source, that you can run outside of the platform. And we have created very recently Visualforce to LWC to help you move from Visualforce to Lightning Web Components and Automation Components. This is the one I mentioned before, to help you adopt our low-code technologies. So every app has a button that allows you to navigate to GitHub. Let's take a look at this one, for example. And in GitHub, you have the code, the full code for the app, and the instructions on how to install it using different means. You can install the apps using a Scratcher or a developer, or you can use, for example, Threadhead program, which is basically the same as a developer, and sometimes you have also packages that allows you to install the app directly, and also instructions on how to create some sample data, how to make things visible for the registered user, as for example, you assigning a permission set or something similar, etc. So it's very useful. One thing to highlight is that we accept contributions. So if you want to make contributions to the sample app, apps, there is a guide that you have to follow to do them in a correct way, but we are super happy to get your contributions, and we will be happy to guide you if there's something that you are not following or whatever. Okay, so with that, I want to focus on the features that we have recently included in the sample apps. Most of those features relate to Summer 20 new functionality, right? What we do is that in every release, once we have the pre-release orgs available, the first day that we have them, we create a new branch that is the pre-release branch. For example, in Summer, we have the pre-release Summer 20 branch, which is there at the moment because we are merging that branch into Master next Monday. So, well, in every release, we will call it like Summer 20 or Winter 21 or whatever, right? So what we do is from that point, we start working on that branch. And we do two kinds of pull requests. First, we do maintenance. Sometimes we need to do maintenance, for example, to upgrade the API version or include new configurations that have been made available on that release, or even sometimes to fix some metadata that happened to us this release because the flexi page metadata has changed because of dynamic forms. Dynamic forms is now in non-GA preview, so it is available in your org, and you can activate them and start playing with them, but that's going to make you change the metadata of the flexi pages if you have them in your version control system. And the other thing that we do is to include new features that showcase the technologies that have been released with that release, in this case the Summer release. And that's the reason we decided to create this webinar, to explain which features we have included in our Summer branch in this release. So let's start talking about these features. The first feature I want to talk about is Lightning Message Service. Lightning Message Service was there in spring, but it was beta, and now it's generally available. There you have the link to the release notes if you want to read them. And if you don't know Lightning Message Service yet, this is a service that allows you to communicate components built with different Salesforce technologies. You can communicate Visualforce pages with Aura components, with Lightning Web components, and even more because you can communicate them if they live in different DOM hierarchies. For example, if you have a Visualforce page in the utility bar and you have a Lightning Web component in a Lightning Console app tab, you can communicate them using Lightning Message Service. It's a service in which you create a message channel, you define a message channel in which you are going to publish messages, and other components are going to subscribe to those messages. Similar to platform events, but it works on the client and at page level. A session level as well. I mean, it doesn't work if you have different pages open or different sessions open, right? So what we have done in the sample gallery apps regarding Lightning Message Service is to replace the usage that we were doing of PubSub, which was the component that we created to allow intercomponent communication before having Lightning Message Service, and we have replaced it by Lightning Message Service in all the sample apps. We have done that in Greenhouse, on e-bikes as well, and in LWC recipes. Additionally, we have created some new recipes in LWC recipes to showcase how Lightning Message Service works. And the first thing to the best way to see that is to show you a demo. So here I have already opened an OR in which I deployed Lightning Web Components. If you deploy the summer branch, because it's not merged yet, right, in master, we are going to merge that on Monday, because it's the Monday after all the production orgs have been upgraded. You are going to see that there is a new tab called Message Service. This new tab contains 3 components that are publishers. We have a Lightning Web Component Publisher, an Aura Component Publisher, and a Visualforce Publisher. They publish messages into a Lightning Message channel. And we have 3 components which are subscribers. We have a Lightning Web Component subscriber, an Aura subscriber, and a Visualforce subscriber. Sorry, for Visualforce we have 2. We have Visualforce Remoting and Visualforce Postback Action, and I'm going to explain you why in a second. So what we do is that every time that I click on a contact, a message is published, and the subscribers read that message and retrieve the contact information from the backend or from the cache, depending on the technology that we are using and depending if the record has been accessed before. So here, for example, if I click on Michael Jones, the components are going to retrieve that contact and are going to update the component itself. So what did we decide to create 2 different components for Visualforce? Well, because the mechanism in which you can connect the Visualforce subscriber to the action that retrieves the data from the backend is pretty different if you use Visualforce Remoting or the traditional postback action. So we decided to create both. There you have both implementations, and you can take a look at the source as with any other recipe from Lightning Web Components recipes. Great. So what else? Yeah, I wanted to mention that there is a small difference between the GA version of Lightning Message Service and the beta version. You know that when we publish something on beta, it's also to gather feedback from customers, and sometimes things change a bit, right? And one of the things that has changed is that we have included a new scope variable that you use to configure to which scope the message is going to be published. The scope variable by default has a value which is active, and it means that the listeners for the message are going to be those in active sections of the page. So for example, if you have a Lightning Console app, only the tab that is active is going to be listening for that message. However, if you configure to be a scope application instead of active, it's going to go all over the place to also the invisible tabs, for example, in a Lightning Console app. And that's a slight difference that you have to bear in mind, because you may need to change your implementation if you were using the beta version. Okay, what else? Well, there is something that has been released with summer, which is CSS Sharing. Now you can create a CSS only module and share it among different Lightning Web Components. This is very useful to reuse styles that are going to apply to several components on the same page or on the same application, right? And there you have the link to the release notes if you want to read them. And the way to do that is super easy. So first you create a component which just contains a CSS file and a metadata file. Then in the other components that you want to include that CSS, you import the module using the add import syntax, and then you can directly use those CSS styles within your components. It's super simple, right? What we did to showcase that in the sample gallery apps was to use a CSS module shared between two existing recipes, and I'm going to show you that as well. So here, if you go to the composition tab, these were two existing recipes. We had composition basics and composition iteration, but we realized that the CSS styles that we were applying to both of them were very similar, and we decided to create a module to share those styles. So what we did was to create a module called CSS library that contains the shared styles. As you can see, this module just contains a CSS file and a metadata file. And then we imported that module within the two components. We imported it in composition basics.css and also in composition iteration.css. As you can see here, you can keep adding more styles that will also work in the same way that those imported from the same library. You can directly use them in the markup as we are doing here, right? Contact type. Great. What else? Well, another thing that has been released with summer are two modules that you can use within your Lightning Web Components to check if a user has a specific user permission or a specific custom permission. In the first way, you import the reference to the permission from the Salesforce user permission module, and in the second way, from the Salesforce custom permission module. Again, we wanted to highlight that in our sample gallery, and what we did was to create a new recipe that checks for custom permission and shows or conditionally shows a piece of markup or another piece of markup depending on that custom permission. And I'm going to show you that. Okay, so in this case, you have to go to the MISC tab in LWC recipes. There, you are going to find a new recipe called MISC permission-based UI. As you can see here, we can see a message that says the permission set is not assigned. This is happening because my user, the one that is viewing the component at the moment, doesn't have that custom permission assigned via permission set or a profile, right? What the description of the recipe says is that what you can do is to assign a permission set to your user that contains that reference to that custom permission, and then the markup is going to change. You will have to refresh the page, right? We're using this in the most simplistic way because that's the purpose of LWC recipes. We want to give you super simple examples that help you learn very easily, right? So I'm going to show you the permission is this one, right? The permission set, and the permission set has this custom permission assigned. So what I'm going to do now is to assign the permission set to my user, as the recipe explains, and I'm going back and I'm going to reload the page to see how this has changed. Now the message says the permission set is assigned. And if we take a look at the code for the recipe, we are not using Apex to check that custom permission. We are using the new module that is part of Summer 20 release. Bear in mind, this doesn't free you from checking for permissions server side, right? But sometimes it's super handy to render to conditionally render some pieces of markup and do some things on the side of the client. Okay, I wanted to highlight other Summer 20 features for which we haven't included a new recipe or something else in our sample gallery apps yet, but basically because we didn't have the bandwidth to do that until today, right? But I want to highlight them because first, I think they are also interesting, and second, we may probably include something for this in the sample gallery very soon, right? So the first one is a new community module. Well, there are two new community modules that have been released: Salesforce Community ID and Salesforce Community Based Path. This allows you to detect the community in which the Lightning Web component is being visualized. And I think this is going to be really useful in the case that you have several communities and you are using the same Lightning Web component in the different communities. And you want to, for example, show something differently in the component depending on the community in which it's being visualized. So super interesting. We also have added support for the get elements by tag name and get elements by class name functions. Bear in mind, these functions are part of the element class on the web API, right? And if you want to query the shadow root interface, this is the template of the component, you still have to use query selector and query selector all, right? Don't get confused with that. But said that, I think these are two very useful new additions that are going to streamline the way in which you write your code in some of the cases. And finally, I wanted to mention something that has been included in Apex. This is an annotation that allows you to define if an Apex class is serializable or deserializable, and it's very flexible because you can assign different values. You can say that it's going to be serializable never, or same namespace, or same package applicable when you have second generation packages, or always. So you have several values that you can assign and control the way in which it's serializable or not. What else? I also wanted to mention some other features that we have included in the sample apps in the last months, right? They are not strictly related to summer 20 updates, but they fill in some of the gaps that we wanted to fill to help developers adopt some of the features, right? One of them, the first of them, is a refactor that we have done to our error panel component. The error panel component was a Lightning Web component that we were using in all the apps, and this error panel component is mainly used when we are using Lightning Data Service or Apex to retrieve data, and no data is returned, and an error is returned instead, right? So we took a look at the Lightning Data system, and we realized that the correct way to show an error when no data is returned is to use a no data illustration as this one that we are seeing here, and that's the reason we decided to refactor the panel component. Also, in the middle of a spring and summer release, the SLDS team released a plugin for VS Code, which is called SLDS Validator. This plugin examines your CSS code, the one that you have in your CSS classes, but also in HTML files, and says to you if you are using the SLDS classes and tokens correctly, and sometimes it gives you suggestions on places in which you can use them, and for example you are using hard-coded values instead, right? What we did was to run this plugin over all our sample apps and fix all the suggestions and errors that the plugin was giving. If you take a look at SLDS, at the Lightning Design System web page, there you are going to find a section that talks about the validator, and there you can go to the Visual Studio Code store and from there install the plugin and see a demo of how the plugin works. Very useful. Another thing that we did was to adapt all our continuous integration system to use GitHub Actions, including code formatting verification with prettier, linting, text execution, coverage reports, packaging. We generate unlocked packages automatically in some of the apps, and much more. If you want to take a look at how we have implemented GitHub Actions, you have to go to any of our apps. In this case, I open the Easy Spaces one, and you have to go to the Actions tab in GitHub. And there you can take a look at the different workflows that we have defined. We have workflows defined for when you create pull requests that go to the pre-release or to the master branch, and some workflows will execute in every commit so that we make sure that the quality that we expect in the code is being followed, right? Also, one thing that we have included recently is that we have configured our apps to follow the S-lint configuration for Aura components, right? This you can take a look at this link here if you want to see how to do that. If you are using Aura components and you want the linter to detect problems with your Aura code or bad practices, right? And finally, we have created a new recipe called LDS Generate Record Input for Create. Is this recipe here, but I'm going to show you better in LWC recipes, right? And this recipe shows how to use get record create defaults and generate record input for create to create a form that enforces field level security and default values. In 99% of the cases, you want to use Lightning Record Form and Lightning Record Edit Form and View Form, but there may be some cases in which you want to create your own custom form. And in those cases, we wanted to showcase how to do that using those functions, because it's it needs a couple of lines of code, and this is the code of the components if you want to take a look. What we did was to create a new field on account, which is area number, and this field has a default value and is creatable, and that's the reason we are showing it in the UI. You will see that if you take a look at the component. Finally, I want to mention that there are some blog posts that we released a couple of days ago that are part of a series called Learn More. These are published in the developer blog. There are also another set of blog posts in the admin blog if you want to take a look. And the ones in the developer blog gives you highlights about features that have been included in Summer 20 for release management, for Einstein Vision and language, for Lightning Message Service. In this one, it's explained everything I explained to you about the scope and the recipes and so on. Lightning Web Components. In this one, you can see all the explanation about the different modules that have been released, the CSS sharing and so on. And finally, this one summarizes what we have seen in this webinar, the updates that we have made to the sample gallery apps on this release. Right? I strongly recommend you to take a look at them if you want to know more. And with that, we have arrived to the end of the webinar. I hope that you liked the webinar. If you have any questions, you can ask me on Twitter. I remind you my Twitter handle, which is albasfdc, alba like salesforce.com sfdc. And thank you so much, and I hope to see you in the next webinar. Bye bye.